And before anybody gets mad at the title, let's be clear about something right from the start. This isn't about a new arrest. This isn't about some shocking federal indictment. This isn't about a new criminal case suddenly appearing out of nowhere. In fact, if you've been following YoungBoy's situation recently, then you know some positive things have happened in his life. The problem is that sometimes bad news doesn't come from something new happening. Sometimes bad news comes from realizing how much time has already been lost. Sometimes bad news comes from looking back at everything that happened and understanding the true cost of those years. And that's exactly why so many fans have been having this conversation lately. Because when you really sit down and examine NBA YoungBoy's career, you start realizing that one of the most talented and successful artists of his generation spent some of the most important years of his prime dealing with legal issues, court restrictions, probation conditions, house arrest requirements, and prison time instead of doing what superstars are supposed to be doing. That's what makes this conversation so difficult. Because unlike many artists who simply fade away due to bad music or lack of talent, nobody questions YoungBoy's talent. Nobody questions his fan base. Nobody questions his ability to generate millions of streams whenever he decides to drop a project. In fact, that's part of what makes the situation so frustrating. Most rappers would do anything to have the type of audience NBA YoungBoy has built. Most artists would do anything to have fans who support them as aggressively and consistently as YoungBoy's supporters do. Yet despite all that success, despite all that popularity, despite all those streaming records and chart placements, it feels like his career has constantly been fighting against circumstances that prevented it from reaching its full potential. And whether you're a fan or not, that's something that's hard to ignore. If you think back to the period when YoungBoy was at his absolute hottest, it felt like he couldn't miss. Every project was getting attention. Every release was generating headlines. Every song was dominating YouTube. His consistency became legendary. There were times when it seemed like YoungBoy could disappear for a month, return with a new project, and immediately become one of the biggest topics in hip-hop again. That's not something many artists can do. That's superstar-level influence. But while all that was happening, another story was developing in the background. A story involving arrests, legal battles, court appearances, restrictions, and constant uncertainty. Every time it felt like YoungBoy was ready to fully capitalize on his momentum, another legal obstacle seemed to appear. And over time, those obstacles started adding up. One thing people often underestimate is how important freedom is to an artist's career. When you're a major rapper, success isn't just about making music. It's about touring. It's about performing. It's about traveling. It's about meeting with executives. It's about networking. It's about attending events. It's about being visible. It's about creating moments that keep your name in front of the public. That's why restrictions can be so damaging. When an artist is dealing with house arrest or court supervision, they lose access to many of the opportunities that help careers grow. They may still be able to record music. They may still be able to release projects. But the business side of being a superstar becomes much harder. And that's exactly what happened throughout large portions of YoungBoy's career. Now imagine being one of the biggest artists in the world and constantly having people ask the same question. When is he getting out? When can he travel? When can he tour? When can he perform? Those questions followed NBA YoungBoy for years. Fans weren't just waiting for music. They were waiting for freedom. They were waiting for the day when he could fully participate in the industry the same way other artists were. And while he managed to remain successful despite those limitations, it's impossible not to wonder what might have happened if those limitations never existed. How many more records would he have sold? How many more shows would he have performed? How many more opportunities would he have created? Those are questions nobody can answer, but they're questions many fans continue asking. The reality is that legal problems don't just affect artists while they're happening. They create long-term consequences. Momentum is one of the most valuable things in entertainment. Once you have momentum, you want to keep building on it. Every successful project should lead to a bigger project. Every successful tour should lead to a bigger tour. Every accomplishment should create new opportunities. But legal issues interrupt momentum. They create pauses. They create uncertainty. They create situations where artists spend time focusing on survival instead of growth. And that's why so many people believe NBA YoungBoy's career followed a different path than it otherwise might have. Not because he lacked talent, not because fans stopped supporting him, but because circumstances repeatedly got in the way. What's amazing is that even with all those obstacles, YoungBoy still achieved things most artists only dream about. He continued releasing music. He continued generating streams. He continued building one of the strongest fan bases in hip-hop. That's why some people consider him one of the most resilient artists of his generation. Very few rappers could deal with the amount of pressure he faced and still maintain that level of popularity. Most careers would have collapsed completely. His didn't. In many ways, his fan base became even more loyal during those difficult years. Fans viewed themselves as supporting somebody who was fighting against enormous odds. That loyalty helped keep his career alive during periods that might have destroyed other artists. But loyalty doesn't erase lost time. That's the painful reality. Fans can support you forever. They can stream every project. They can defend you online. They can show up whenever you release new music. But they can't give you back years. They can't replace opportunities that were missed. They can't recreate moments that have already passed. That's why so many people describe this situation as bad news. Not because YoungBoy is finished, not because his career is over, but because people are beginning to understand how much those years may have cost him. The consequences weren't always visible in real time. Sometimes consequences only become obvious when you look back and compare what happened with what could have happened. Another thing that's worth mentioning is the emotional toll. People often talk about legal battles from a business perspective, but rarely discuss the mental side. Imagine trying to remain creative while constantly dealing with court dates, lawyers, legal uncertainty, public scrutiny, and media attention. Imagine trying to focus on making music while your future feels unpredictable. That's not easy. That's not something most people could handle. Yet YoungBoy was expected to continue producing music, maintaining his fan base, and operating like everything was normal. That's an enormous amount of pressure for anybody, especially somebody living under constant public attention. And now that some of those legal issues are finally behind him, a new question is starting to emerge. What happens next? That's the question fans are asking. That's the question the industry is asking. Because for the first time in a long time, there's a possibility that NBA YoungBoy could have more freedom than he's had in years. The challenge is figuring out how to rebuild momentum after spending so much time fighting battles outside of music. The industry has changed. The competition has changed. The landscape has changed. But the opportunity is still there. The talent is still there. The fan base is still there. That's why this moment feels so important. On one hand, there's optimism. Fans are excited about the future. They're excited about new music. They're excited about new opportunities. They're excited about seeing what YoungBoy can accomplish without some of the restrictions that previously held him back. On the other hand, there's also a sense of frustration, a sense that things could have been even bigger, a sense that years of legal problems interrupted what should have been one of the most dominant runs in modern hip-hop. Both of those emotions can exist at the same time. Fans can be excited about the future while still being disappointed about the past. And that's really why this is bad news for NBA YoungBoy and his fans. Not because of something that happened today, not because of a new arrest, not because of a new charge. The bad news is the realization of how much was lost. The realization that some of the most important years of one of hip-hop's biggest stars were spent fighting battles outside of music. The realization that no matter how successful he became, those years can never be recovered. The good news is that the story isn't over. The future hasn't been written yet. There are still opportunities ahead. There are still projects to release. There are still goals to achieve. But as fans look toward that future, many can't help but wonder how different things might have been if those lost years had never happened in the first place.